Okay, good evening, everyone, and lovely to see you all as always. Thank you so much for joining. So I've posted the link to the handouts in the chat group for those who didn't get it. I wanted to look at a sequence of psukim addressed to judges, which of course is a major theme of this week's Sedra. The Mishpatim, the Sedra deals with judicial processes. They're hopefully some of the lessons are relevant to all of us, whilst many of us, most of us are not engaged in the judiciary. We're not judges and not even lawyers. All of us, in a sense, have to make judgments and decisions and interact with other people and weigh up competing rights and wrongs. And in that sense, many of the lessons of Mishpatim are relevant to all of us. So I want to try and look at one pasuk, and if we have time, maybe we'll use the time to look at the second pasuk. In the source sheets, I really just printed one pasuk, and you will note that I printed the pasuk in a slightly unusual format. And I did so because the pasuk is very, very hard to translate and to parse successfully. And the pasuk says, if you look in the sources, I pasted in the chat, I pasted the sources for those who don't have it. Lo siya achrei rabim l'ra'os, and I translated each word separately. Lo siya, do not be or do not follow, after rabim, the many, l'ra'os, to do bad or to the bad. Then it carries on, v'lo saneh, which means do not, lo ta'aneh, don't answer, don't respond. Al riv, for a quarrel, on a quarrel. Lintos, to follow. Achri rabim, after the many. Lahatos, to follow. So this is a very difficult pasuk to translate. And I printed the format in this format in order to avoid the need to put punctuation in, because actually I wasn't sure how to punctuate the pasuk. And I'm in good company in not being sure how to punctuate the pasuk, because the pasuk is very hard to punctuate. It's very difficult to tell what's really going on in this difficult pasuk. So how do we group the words of the pasuk and how do we explain what's going on? So the first part of the pasuk seems reasonably easy to translate. The second part of the pasuk, however, is very difficult. The first part of the pasuk says, Lo siya achrei rabim lahatos, don't follow after the majority in order to do evil, to do that which is not good. But the second part of the pasuk, where is the comma? V'lo sa'ana al riv, don't respond to a quarrel. Lintos, to follow, achrei rabim lahatos, to follow after the many. So is it a repetition, a reiteration of the first half of the pasuk? Don't, v'lo saneh, don't respond to a quarrel by following the majority. In which case, what's the difference between the first line and the second line, which both say don't follow a majority? Or is this separate? In which lo saneh al riv lintos, don't respond to a lawsuit by lintot, to veer, achrei rabim lahatos, but follow after the majority. In which case, we have a contradiction in the pasuk. Now, Rashi already addresses this difficulty, and somewhat unusually for Rashi, he brings several explanations of the pasuk. In particular, he brings the medrash of Chazal, the explanation of Chazal, and he brings Unclus, and he argues with both of them. V'ani omer, he says, but I say. This is a very unusual language for anyone who's familiar with Rashi. Rashi normally follows his predecessors. The skill and beauty and wisdom of the language of Rashi is how he cuts and pastes, if you like, into the text, the explanations he gives, but normally he follows the thinking of Chazal. In this case over here, he brings Chazal, he brings the Medrash, he brings Unclus, and he says, I don't understand either of them. Maybe we'll just look at the first two lines of Rashi, printed directly onto the pasuk. Lo siachu rabim l'rois. Yesh b'mikra zeh midrashi chachmei Yisrael. There are many midrashim from the sages of Israel. Aval ein lashon hamikra miyushav behen al ufanov. The language of the verse does not fit in context according to them. So Rashi here, who is the sets himself the task of giving pshat, says that he doesn't think that what Chazal say is pshat in the pasuk. This reminds us of something we've discussed before, how psukim are meant to be understood on many levels. And we will see that the Medrash halacha that Rashi brings is an absolutely applicable halacha. It's not a piece of abstract reasoning. It's something that's very, very nogea, very relevant halacha l'maisa. It's something that's absolutely fundamental in practical halacha. And yet, Rashi here says this isn't pshat. It's a good way of reading the pasuk, maybe, but it isn't pshat in the psukim, and therefore we shouldn't think that by learning this we have achieved full understanding of pshat in the pasuk. And therefore Rashi says, I'm going to give a different explanation. The halachic explanation remains. The halachic explanation is important, but in terms of understanding the simplest reading of the pasuk, that's not what the pasuk means. Multiple layers of understanding psukim. This is how Rashi here understands the verse, and unusually he questions and critiques both Onkelos and Chazal, and he says Vaniyome, he gives his own explanation. But let's try and work through how he understands this pasuk. So the first point that Rashi says is that for Chazal, the translation of the word l'ra'ot to the bad don't follow lo siach rabim l'ra'os, don't follow what the majority say for the bad, cannot mean don't follow for a bad or evil conclusion. It can't mean for evil, because obviously you don't follow the majority in a case of evil. That doesn't need to be said. So what does it mean? It means for a bad or negative outcome. Don't follow the majority for a negative outcome. In other words, a declaration of guilt. Now, in civil cases, there is no bad outcome. In a civil dispute, there are by definition two parties, and what's good for one is bad for the other, and what's bad for one is good for the other. So therefore, this can only be talking about capital or criminal cases, where there are no two parties, there's only one party. And Rashi understands that this pasuk is teaching us that Chazal that Rashi is quoting, is that a slim or bare majority isn't enough in a dispute that involves l'ra'os, that which is evil, that which is negative. So the pasuk is saying, do not follow the majority to declare someone guilty of crime. Only follow the majority to declare someone innocent. Very fascinating idea. That in many systems of law, there are differences between civil law and criminal law, where you need different weights of evidence for civil as opposed to criminal law. Halacha doesn't have that. However, it does have a difference in the majority that you need for a criminal case. And the pasuk Rashi Chazal understand can only be talking about a criminal case, because only a criminal case can be referred to as l'ra, as one that has a bad outcome. No civil case has a bad outcome, because by definition, what's good for one is bad for the other. So how do you decide a court case? So Chazal understands the pasuk is saying the minimum. Don't follow a bare majority for a negative outcome. You need a thicker majority, a more significant majority. You need at least a majority of two. So if you only have a majority of one, is the person guilty or innocent? Well, not really. In halachic terms, we don't have, in a sense, we don't have a concept of guilt and innocence. That's up to Hashem. All we have is chayav. Are they obligated? Will they receive a penalty or not? So when it comes to the rise to giving a penalty, if there's a slim majority, then they're potter. They're exempt from the penalty. They may be guilty, but they're exempt from punishment. In other words, one needs a significant majority, a thick majority, a two-person majority as a minimum, in order to obligate someone according to Chazal. Now, the Malbim, which I printed on the bottom of the source sheet, he gives a sort of an insight into understanding this halacha. And he says that when it comes to capital punishment, one needs two or more, similar or parallel to the rule with testimony, with witnesses, where also you need a double witness. You need two witnesses in order to make someone guilty, and therefore this is where he says one gets this idea of having two. In the same way as with witnesses, you need two. Similarly, with civil, with majority of judges, you need two. In other words, it's telling something about two perspectives, two viewpoints. One viewpoint that's swinging the equation isn't enough. Two viewpoints means that there's a multiplicity of perspectives, and therefore that's enough. What this is also telling us is that whilst we have an obligation to do justice, we have an obligation to do mishpat, we can't just say, leave it up to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Nonetheless, there's also recognition of human limits. And we humans can't easily step forward and do justice. What gives us the right to impose justice on someone else? Pasuk says, Ki mishpat le'elokimhu, justice is to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. All we can do is what we are entitled to do. And therefore there are restrictions and limits on what we're able to do. We need a degree of certainty beyond that, beyond the norm, and we can't go beyond that. If we're unable, therefore, to impose a penalty, we're unable to impose a penalty, and there's nothing we can do. This, by the way, is the source of the concept that would be very rare for a Beis Din to issue capital punishment. The concept that there were two parallel systems of justice in the halachic system. There was justice done as a practical means to protect society. So if you have a criminal who is a danger to fellow citizens, then such a criminal maybe would be locked up or punished in some other way in order to protect citizens. If there's a need for a disincentive to warn people off doing crimes, then there'll be a system to give them that warning. This is a sort of utilitarian theory of punishment. What gives us as a society the ability to punish other people? Technical utility. We need to protect ourselves. We need to warn criminals off and scare them off, and therefore we will punish them by locking them away or imposing some other penalty in order to protect ourselves or in order to scare them off. This was not the role of the Beis Din. This was the executive that would do this. This was the role of the government or the Melech, as the Rambam and the Ran explain. What was the role of the Beis Din? Fundamental. It's a Beis Din. It's a house of justice. It's a place that aligns reality, the physical reality, with the way it ought to be. In Hebrew, there's two words for justice. There's mishpat, but there's also din. The technical meaning of the word din is alignment with how things ought to be. So it's the word ought. A Beit Din is an idealized microcosm in which how the world ought to be. The world is made to align with how it ought to be. But the ability to exercise din is a privilege. It's not something to take for granted. It's really the role of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's not given in general to human beings to do. It's interesting, we talk about us humans having the obligation to imitate God, but all the examples the sages give of imitating God are in Mahu Rachum, Afatahaye Rachum, just like he is merciful, you should be merciful, Mahu Chanun, just like he is gracious, you should be gracious. Din, justice, aligning of the world in order of how it ought to be, that's not the role of humans, unless granted to them by God-given right, by given the Mishpat Elokim, Elokim Nitzov Badas Kel, the ability of people to step into the role of Elokim. When can we do this? When we have absolute certainty. If we don't, then there's nothing we can do. We may need to step in for practical measures. That's the role of the government, the king, to sort out. We need certainty, and therefore the Beis Din wouldn't rely on circumstantial evidence. Beis Din would need a very high level of hasra, of warning, in order to be certain that the criminal had understood the consequences of what they were doing. A king wouldn't have to follow these criteria, even if there's circumstantial evidence, even if there's no clear warning. Nonetheless, a government can act because they need to ensure the functioning of society. Beis Din only when we have absolute certainty of so doing. The halacha of hasra, of warning, is an interesting one. It's not enough that someone does a crime in front of witnesses. They need to know that their witness is there, and the witnesses have to warn them of the consequence. And more than that, the criminal has to receive the warning, has to accept the warning. It's called, they have to accept the hasra, they have to acknowledge it. Otherwise, they can claim we didn't understand the implications, we didn't hear the warning. They have to say we accept the warning, and despite that, we want to do the crime, because we need a level of certainty. For a beis din to act, they are taking life or applying din and judgment and realignment to another human being, trying to shape society into the idealized image of how we think it ought to be, is veering near a fundamentalism of sorts. A fundamentalism takes an idealized view of the world and thinks it can reconfigure society into that form, whether it's fundamentalism of communism or a political philosophy or fascism or religious, no difference. For us to be able to do that is the role of beis din, and therefore much protection needs to be built around this. And therefore this is the first halacha over here, that the beis din have to, there needs to be for capital punishment, there needs to be a thick majority, a majority of 2, rather than a majority of 1. So this is how Rashi, based upon the thinking of Chazal, understands the first line of the pasuk. When it comes to penalties, to punishments, don't follow a simple majority. You need at least more than a simple majority, which Chazal understood to be 1 more than a majority, 2, perhaps as explained by the Malbim, that 2 gives 2 different perspectives. Then Rashi carries on, and if we go back to our source sheet again and look at the original pasuk, I've pasted the source sheet in the chat. The second half of the pasuk has 2 clauses in Chazal's understanding. V'lo saner al riv lintos, comma, and as we saw in the pasuk, it's not clear where the more significant comma should be placed. Achrei rabim lahatos, after the majority, you should follow. So Chazal understand this is in a sense, a contradiction to the first clause. What does it mean when it says Achrei rabim lahatos? That means if there's a significant majority, then you can follow them. But lo si achrei rabim lahatos, don't follow for an obligation a slim majority, only a majority of 1. So these are the 2 halves of the psukim. And finally, the middle says, V'lo saner al riv. Don't respond to it normally means, don't respond to a riv, to a quarrel, to a disagreement, lintos, to veer after this disagreement, on which Rashi quotes Chazal, who reads the pasuk differently. Don't veer after a rav. The meaning of the word is rav, that which is many, meaning that which is, or multiple, that which is great, that which is senior. Meaning, don't let yourself be swayed by a senior point of view. And from this we learn the halacha, in how the sages read it, avoid a scenario of being faced with a conflict where I will need to argue with a more senior figure and distort the judgment. So what does this mean? Either I shouldn't argue, in other words, I face a conflict. On the one hand, I shouldn't argue with a senior. I need to be aware of my limitations as a human and others' expertise. On the other hand, I have a responsibility to give a judgment. So what do you do in a court which inevitably includes more senior judges and less senior judges? How do I resolve this issue? And on that, the balance the pasuk finds, according to this understanding, ensure that the junior judge voices his view before the senior judge, and that way I won't cause the justice to veer after the senior one. So what does it mean for lo saner al rav, according to the Chazal's understanding? Even though the pasuk says lo saner al riv, they translate it, don't argue with a senior authority. Either don't argue, because it's wrong to argue with seniors, and therefore the junior has to go first, avoiding with this conflict, or it's saying not you shouldn't, but you won't. In other words, it's reflecting the human tendency to avoid confrontation by voting for the junior view first. Now, Rashi rejects this reading. He doesn't tell us exactly why he rejects this reading, but we can speculate that it has 2 weaknesses. The first weakness is that it doesn't exactly distinguish in the pasuk when you do and when you don't follow the majority. All it says is, don't follow the majority in bad cases, and do follow the majority. And we need to work out that it's talking about two different forms of majority, a slim majority and a thick majority. Interestingly, halacha, in practical halacha, we certainly do read the pasuk this way, and this is how the court system works. Nonetheless, Rashi says this isn't a good reading in Pshat. The second aspect that perhaps bothered Rashi is the translation of the word al-riv, not as a quarrel, but as responding against a more senior figure. Now, this is a classic example of how we have to be cautious with midrashim, and sometimes understand where a medrash is coming from, and what Chazal seem to be doing as a pun may in fact be a careful reading of the pasuk. So Rashi read this almost as a pun. Al-riv, don't argue against the Rav, the senior authority, and this is an unusual translation of the word riv. Normally means a quarrel, but here it means a senior authority. On page 2, I printed Samson Raphael Hirsch, who defends Chazal's reading the pasuk, but not in this strange reading of riv as a rebbe or a teacher. He says the real translation of the pasuk is, don't respond to a controversy, a debate in court, in riv, in a way which will cause you to veer off the truth. So don't respond to a court case lintot in a way that will cause a veering from the truth. In other words, be careful when you structure your judicial system that you don't build a structure that could cause truth veering to occur. And therefore, an example of this would be letting a senior speak before a junior. So Chazal summarized that idea in a way that sounds like a pun, but actually they're coming from a careful reading of the pasuk, in which the pasuk is saying, don't let justice be structured in a way that will lead to veering off the truth. So again, we see here this sensitivity in which one finds a balance between respect for senior on the one hand, on the other hand, needing to have a system in which truth will persist, and the balance between modesty and awareness of limitation on the one hand, and on the other hand, an expectation to live up to responsibility. David posted to me in a private chat asking about the degree to which the trop can help resolve this issue. So the trop, the laning notes, acts as a punctuation system of sorts. And I'm conscious I'm in the presence of Baalei Korah here. I see David here, I see Ian Bider here. I can't see if there's any other Baalei Korah on group here. So I need to be careful what I say in the presence of those who are senior to me and who know a lot more about diktuk and laning than I do. However, I believe that one has here, as David pointed out, two forms of pause. One has the lintus has the tvir, and then the rabbin has the tikra. Now, it is true that the tvir is the lesser pausal note, and the tikra is a more significant pausal note. Nonetheless, we effectively have two types of commas over here, and it doesn't seem possible, therefore, to determine with absolute clarity how the lintos fits in. And therefore, whilst there's indication of the more significant pause and the lesser pause, it seems from Rashi and Chazal that they didn't consider this to be an absolute determinant, and this lintos still floats uneasily between the first half of the pasuk and the second half of the pasuk. But Ian, I see you want to say something about this.
No, well, I agree. David's nodding in affirmation as well, and I agree with that.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So I haven't made thankfully haven't made a fool of myself on that particular one. The truth is, I knew I hadn't because I was following Rashi over here. So I knew I was in good company, because this is what Rashi's really telling us, that the lintos veers in the middle. So I was treading in Rashi's footsteps here. Okay. So this is Rashi's. This is Chazal's understanding. In which they understand that the pasuk in the second half is not telling us don't follow a majority, but it's saying do follow a significant majority. Onkelos also seems to go with this balance between perhaps modesty and human autonomy and responsibility. And maybe I'll give a little bit of background. In halacha, a judge can abstain from voicing an opinion. However, in that case, it is effectively considered rendered a non-judgment, and the court needs to sit again. And let me explain the logic of this, because there's something paradoxical over here. Let's take a simple court case of 3. So we're not dealing here with penalties or punishment, but we're just dealing with a monetary dispute. If you have 2 judges, let's say, who argue that A is the correct party, and you have a 3rd judge who argues that B is the correct party, then we follow the majority and the psak is issued. However, if the 3rd judge abstains, then the psak is not followed, and this is considered a mistrial, and there's a need for Beis Din to reconvene. And this is a fascinating idea. What would be the logic behind this? If the judge voices an opinion, so 2 say guilty and 3rd says innocent, we have 3 minds, 3 approaches, 3 judges voicing an opinion. When it comes to civil disputes, we follow the majority, very simple. However, if the 3rd judge abstains, in other words, feels incapable of voicing an opinion, that means in this case, he is no judge. They're not a judge. In which case, we have a court made up of 2 judges and a 3rd non-judge. Such a court can't issue a ruling. Fascinating concept. When the ruling is issued by Beis Din, it is all 3 who are issuing the ruling. The 2 who said guilty and the 1 who said innocent. If the 3rd one abstains, then we then have 3 issuing a ruling, with the majority determining the view of all 3, the psak of all 3. We have someone who has stepped out of psak and has given a non-psak, and therefore we have a ruling issued by Beis Din emerging from a 2-judge court, and therefore an invalid view. Says Unclus, a judge can only abstain if they indeed are unable to judge. However, in a situation in which they have a viewpoint, they are not allowed to refrain from their judgment. And therefore he translates the pasuk as follows. Lo sana al-riv, you shouldn't respond concerning a quarrel, lintos, by turning away. In other words, if someone asks you something concerning the law, don't answer by turning aside and distancing yourself from the quarrel, but judge it honestly. So says the Targum Unclus in the way that Rashi quotes him. So the sana al-riv, don't respond. Sana means answer or respond. Don't respond to a court case by withdrawing from it. Now there is an interesting paradox over here, because someone who believes there is a miscarriage of judgment and disagrees with the majority can sabotage the psak of Beis Din by abstaining rather than by voicing an opinion. So whether the Targum is talking even in that case or just generally, nonetheless, he's saying it's inappropriate in an argument to step back and bow to the majority. Now, what might this person be thinking in understanding that they're stepping back and arguing with the majority? So let's have a look at Rashi's 3rd Peshat, and then we'll understand it. Now, I already said that when the pasuk said, don't follow the majority, l'ra'os, Chazal said, this is obvious. Of course you shouldn't follow the majority in a situation in which they are declaring something which is evil. Obviously, this bad, must mean a bad consequence for the defendant who's standing in trial. Don't follow them with simple majority in a case where you are sentencing someone. Rashi isn't having any of that. Rashi says, no, the pasuk means don't follow the majority for a bad outcome. Don't follow the majority to do evil. In Ra'isa Rashoyim Matim Mishpat, if you see evil people perverting justice, Lo Soma, don't say, Hol V'Rabim Hein, Hinini No Tachreim, since they are many, I will follow after them. So why does Rashi think this is a reasonable reading? Why does Rashi think it's acceptable for the pasuk to say, don't follow the majority to evil, and Chazal that Rashi quotes say, no, it can't mean don't follow the majority to evil, because of course we don't follow the majority to evil. It must mean don't follow the majority to declare a bad outcome for the defendant, i.e. criminal sentencing. Evidently, there would be a rationale in following the majority for the bad cause. And here I think the way to understand Rashi is based on the reading of the Ibn Ezra, which I think I printed in the short, I did print it, but we won't have time to look at it inside, who says that there may be a form of epistemological modesty that can lead one to going wrong. What do you do when you see that everyone else in the world thinks you're wrong? How do you deal with that? And you are convinced that what's going on is a moral failure. Now, you may think that there's a time to be modest. At this point, if I'm sure everyone is wrong, I need to surrender. I would think that I should be nota achari rabim l'rois. I should follow the majority, even for an evil and bad outcome, because evidently there's something I'm missing. And modesty is very often a good quality, epistemological modesty. Modesty about what we can know is also a good quality. The Ibn Ezra, in his own shah, he's not coming to explain Rashi, but seemingly this would be how Rashi would learn. So no, one shouldn't follow the majority. Now, don't surrender your own thinking, your autonomy of thought when you are seeing something bad that's happening. You need to be able to stand up against the majority, even in such a scenario. So we're pretty much running out of time over here, but I hope these alternate reading in the Psukim show us both the subtlety of the Psukim, difficult Psukim to understand, and also how the Mefarshim and the Psukim, Chazal, Unkras, Rashi, grappled with not just the reading of the Psukim, but the moral implications about how we are meant to take decision making and how we're meant to go. I'll conclude with a thought of the Chasam Sofer, who says he was confronted by someone who, through the pasuk of Achri Rabban Hatos, and I printed this Chasam Sofer right at the bottom of the page, Chasam Sofer and Moshe Sofer, the Rav in Frankfurt born, Rav in Pressburg, and probably one of the first rabbinic leaders to confront defection from orthodoxy. It wasn't yet called orthodoxy in those days, but defection from the norm, the mainstream, if you like, on a mass scale. So the very early start of the rise of a breakaway from traditional Judaism. And one such skeptic approached him and said an argument that we can often wonder about, surely we should follow the majority. How can we persist in our beliefs when we live in a world which majority disagrees with our assumptions? Now, there's a lot that could be said on this argument. A question about which sort of people ought to have a voice and a vote in discussions, people who haven't thought seriously about an issue here. This possibly said in the context of judges who are hopefully seriously contemplating and thinking about an issue and are qualified to render judgment. Not necessarily every decision made by someone who's unqualified to render judgment should be taken seriously. In addition, one would have to calculate the maths of different theologies and views around the world with great care. And cancel out different perspectives when we need to look at the variety of different views and work out actually whether there is a clear majority for any particular theological position. But the Chasam Sofer picked up on the language of lintos. It doesn't say blindly follow the majority. It says lintos. When there's something in which there's an argument either way, that's the time to follow majority. In other words, when you hear both perspectives and you understand it's nuanced and you understand there's a judgment call that needs to be weighed about how one weighs up competing points of view and competing values and competing perspectives, at that point, one follows the majority. However, when something is not a natiyah, it's not a directional issue, it's not a veering, it's a matter of clarity and certainty, and I see with the eyes of my reason what something is, at that point, majority is not a relevant factor to bring into play. Majority is relevant when there's nuance. Majority is relevant when I see perspectives and I recognize judgment call. Majority isn't relevant when I have proof or absolute conviction. So says the Chasam Sofer as a concluding thought in the language, nuance of language used in this pasuk. So I will stop there for today in our reading of Mishpatim, and a pasuk which I think tells us something about truth and also the limit of human reason, which is what I entitled this part of the shiur. The second part of the shiur, I want to talk about the laws of Bishul, and actually I should have said this earlier, so I'll just use this as a chance to remind everyone. The regular shiur will not take place next week. Instead, I'll be giving a special shiur on the laws of Purim, the halachas of Purim, particularly in the context of COVID and Purim on a Friday. So for those who haven't seen it, I gave out a sheet of guidance as to how we should be keeping Purim at the moment on how we should plan for Purim rather at the moment, given the COVID challenges that we will be facing. And I want to give a shiur in which I explain much of the halachic background behind that and explain how we should run a Purim. In addition, there's the second halachic complexity of it being on a Friday, and I'll explain how that works. So that will be next Wednesday evening. I'll post a link for those who haven't seen it to my summary of the halachas of Purim. I've just posted that in the chat. That will be next week, so it won't be our regular Parsha and Halacha. But reverting to this week's topic, I want to use the time that's remaining to speak about the laws of cooking and heating food and reheating food in the kitchen on Shabbat. Now, we haven't spoken about these for a couple of weeks. I don't want to spend too much time doing Chazorah, but we defined Bishul as changing the state of food, whether it's hardening to softening, softening to hardening, whether it's food or non-food, making it edible to non-edible to edible. We also distinguished between liquids and solids. In solids, in general, once it has been cooked, it's now rendered edible. With liquids, the concept of rawness is less relevant. Let's take water as an extreme example. It's the heating, which is the malacha that's pertinent. Once it is heated, it is considered cooked. Once it is cooled down, it loses its cookiness. The cold soup and hot soup is a different experience. It's the heat which counts as cooking. We also discussed what's called the level of cooking, what we mean by heat. We spoke about the concept of yad soledes, somewhere between 43 and 70 degrees, when the hand feels withdraws from heat and finds it too hot. That's with liquids. And with solids, we spoke about machal ben drosoi. Ben drosoi was a bandit who used to eat semi-raw food, barely edible food, which is a third or a half cooked. So we discussed these ideas. And then finally, we looked at the concept of kli rishon, kli sheni, and this is where we were up to. And we spoke about the paradox that often makes this concept hard to understand. So just to remind ourselves of the concept, in halacha, a pot with food or liquid in, which is on the flame, is referred to as a kli rishon, the first utensil. Al ha'ish, it's on the fire. If it's taken off the fire, it is still a kli rishon, but it's husar me'a'ish, it's off the fire. That's a first utensil on the fire and off the fire. If I pour out of the pot and I pour into a second container, that's a kli sheni, a second container. If I pour into a third container, it's a kli shlishi, a third container. And we will see, we haven't yet discussed this, different halachas around whether it is considered inappropriate cooking or heating by putting food in contact with a kli rishon, a kli sheni, or a kli shlishi. Now, before we go into the halachas, there's a concept we need to understand, which I explained briefly a couple of weeks ago, and I'll just repeat again very, very in brief, which is there seems to be something paradoxical about this. Because let's say liquid in a kli sheni, or solid in a kli sheni, which is 90 degrees, in many cases is assumed not to be able to cook because it's in a kli sheni. Whereas liquid in a kli rishon, which is just above yad soledes, 50 degrees, is considered able to cook because it's above yad soledes, it's above the temperature of heating, even though it's much lower, it's much less hot, it's much cooler than the 90 degree in the kli sheni. So why does it make a difference whether it's in a first utensil or a second utensil? Why should this make a halachic difference in terms of the definition of cooking? And the very answer that we gave, in very brief, is that normative cooking is considered to take place through heating on a fire. If you heat through another heat source, such as hot springs, Chamei Tiveria, the hot springs of Tiveria in the example of the Gemara, or the sun beating down, this is not aish, it's not fire, and therefore it isn't considered cooking. Why is fire an essential item for cooking? Either because this is the definition of how cooking is defined in halacha as per the Mishkan, or because this is the usual way of cooking. And perhaps the distinction between these two models would be if you find a usual way of cooking which isn't fire linked, like perhaps a microwave or something of the sort. Either way, in practice, cooking is defined as heating through fire. So now we get to indirect means of transmitting the fire, the heat of the fire to the object being cooked. And this is the point of a first utensil, second utensil, third utensil, because a first utensil carries in it the heat of the fire. It was on the flame and now it's been taken off the flame, but it's still a kli rishon. The kli sheni only has a second degree, a child of the heat of the fire, toldat eish, because it gets the heat through transferring the hot liquid into it. So I take my hot soup from the kli rishon and I pour it into the kli sheni, the second utensil. The kli sheni absolutely heats up. It's 90 degrees hot now. But how did it get the heat? From a child of the heat, toldat eish, from an offspring of the heat, from a second degree of fire heat rather than the first degree. And therefore, and so on to third degree, third utensil and fourth utensil and so on. And therefore in halacha, the second utensil the kli sheni, albeit hotter than the first utensil. The first utensil I took off the fire and I let it cool down, and it's now only 60 degrees. The second utensil is very hot, it's 90 degrees, nonetheless has a lower status with respect to Bishul because it is a second degree, it's removed from the fire, and since Bishul is with the heat of fire, this is the heat of the product of fire, but not the heat of the fire itself, and therefore it is treated differently in halacha. So that's the conceptual framework of why there's that distinction. But how does this actually translate into practical halacha? So we've spent really 2 weeks, 2 sessions on introducing halachic terminology. Today I would like to actually start with practical halachic ramifications of these insights that we've achieved, and understand this in practical halachic terms. So kli rishon, if I have a pot on the fire and I add something raw to it, or something not fully cooked, fully, I have transgressed the prohibition of cooking midoraisa lusavasha. This is sorry, not lusavasha, one of the lamates malachas, one of the 39 malachas. I've transgressed the malacha of cooking. Similarly, Chazal understood that even if the pot is off the flame, assuming it's still hot enough to make some change, it hasn't cooled it down, it's above Yad Soletas, 43 degrees, and perhaps even in some instances less than that, it can also cook because it carries the heat of the fire in it. It's been heated up by fire, and this is a way of heating through fire. And therefore, we assume in most cases, this would also be Bishul. There are very rare exceptions, things which are exceptionally hard to cook, where we understand even something removed by one stage is one stage removed from the flame. It doesn't cook, maybe like a very tough piece of meat or the like, but in general, we would assume that a kli rishon always cooks. And therefore, in practical halacha, other than with very rare exceptions, one can never put something inside a kli rishon if it's raw or hasn't been cooked. As long as, of course, it's yad soletas, as long as it is still hot. Then we have liquid poured out of a kli rishon, which is known as iroi kli rishon. And iroi kli rishon, as it's poured out, obviously it removes itself from the pot. It loses some of its heat in the process of being poured, even before it enters into the kli sheni, even as it arrives in the second pot. So what is the rule with iroi kli rishon, the pouring out of a kli rishon? And the answer is that we assume it does cook, but only a superficial cooking, a surface level cooking. So if I pour from my pot onto solids, bishul still occurs, albeit only skin deep bishul. In halacha, this is known as a kadei klippa, shell thickness of cooking. We assume minimal cooking occurs with kli rishon, and therefore in practical halacha, iroi kli rishon, pouring out of a hot first stage pot, would also be forbidden. However, this is when you pour on solids. But let's analyze what happens when you pour on liquids. Now, when you pour on liquids, the liquid I'm pouring pours momentarily onto the surface of the liquid, but because of the viscosity of the liquid, the surface is immediately disrupted, such that there is no skin of the liquid, with most liquids, which becomes instantaneously cooked. In other words, even though the pouring onto the surface creates a minor skin deep cooking process, there has to be some level of length of contact. With liquids, by definition, because they don't have a stable surface, and there's a natural mix that occurs almost instantly through the application of the heat and the liquid that's being poured into it. Therefore, no part of the liquid gets cooked with the iroi kli rishon. And therefore, we have 2 scenarios. If I pour sufficient hot liquid such that the whole liquid, the eventual mixture, the outcome, becomes heated to above Yad Soletas, then I have a problem of Bishul, because I've heated the sum totality of the liquid to Yad Soletas, and therefore out of all of that, there must be a surface which has become heated. However, if I use a small quantity of liquid such that it becomes warmed, lukewarm, but not Yad Soletas, not a level that would be uncomfortable to a degree to touch, perhaps 43 degrees, as we discussed, and upwards of that, in that situation there, nothing has occurred that's halachically problematic. The sum totality hasn't become heated up. The surface hasn't become heated because liquids don't have a stable surface. And therefore, when I am pouring from a kli rishon into another liquid, and I'm only pouring enough to take the chill off, to make it lukewarm, I'm allowed to pour hot water directly from an urn or a kettle into a container of cold water. And I emphasize again, as long as the cold water won't become above yad toledos, won't become hot. So this, is the status of iroi kli rishon. And I hope the logic of these halachas is now becoming apparent to us. Then we get to a kli sheni, a second degree utensil. And as we've explained, this is any utensil where I've poured from the kli rishon into the kli sheni. So if I have my urn on the flame, that's the kli rishon, I run water out of the urn. As it runs out, it's iroi kli rishon, it's the pouring out of the kli rishon, and then it lands in the second utensil, and that is a kli sheni. Now, in principle, a kli sheni is only a toldas eish, it's the offspring of the fire, a second stage offspring, and therefore it shouldn't cook, other than rare exceptions, which is what Chazal refer to as kalei habishul, things which become easily cooked, items which are maybe very finely ground and very, very thin and highly susceptible to heat, and have a change of state through even a relatively low and swift application of heat. These items become cooked even through a kli sheni. Now, there are some items which are intuitively kalei habishul. Perhaps, like I said, very finely ground spice is the place can say a raw egg. You can pour hot water over a raw egg, and you can see it begins whitening and congealing a little bit, even though only boiling water is poured over it. Things which are very finely ground, very thin and flaky, or perhaps kalei habishul. However, the definition of kalei habishul has become very unclear in practical halachic process, and very little is known to us about how to define kalei habishul. The problem here, just to explain the background, is really twofold. It's not, if you pour hot liquid over even something which clearly isn't kalei habishul, like a piece of meat or the like, it does create some level of effect on the surface. Nonetheless, this isn't a problem because that's the definition of kli sheni, that it's too far removed from the fire for us to be concerned about. So how exactly do we measure what level of effect of a kli sheni would cross the threshold to a kalei habishul or not? It's very unclear to determine that. And even something very intuitive like tea leaves or coffee, where we always will, or often will use a kli sheni, and very clearly it still produces the tea. It's not actually clear whether the effect on the tea leaves is that of cooking, or it's enough to draw out the flavor of the leaves. So this isn't a scientific question, it's a philosophical question or a conceptual question about what exactly we mean by significant cooking. And there's not really a objective way to determine this other than through halachic sources, and unfortunately the halachic sources are exceptionally unclear on this matter. So this is one thing that's unclear with kalei habishul. A second point that is unclear with kalei habishul are things which are we only concerned with kli sheni, with a second degree kalei habishul, or are we even concerned with a kli shlishi, a kli revi, a third and fourth and fifth utensil? And therefore, in practical halacha, I adopt a compromise position, and this is the view of many rabbanim, in which something which is definitely a kalei habishul, something which is definitely kal habishul, easily cooked, we are machmir for a kli shlishi. However, something which is not clearly kalei habishul, even though we are stringent for it, we are not stringent for pouring out of a kli sheni. So in brief, just to summarize, to make this absolutely crystal clear, if you have a definite kalei habishul, something which definitely is easily cooked, it is forbidden in a kli sheni, and arguably even in a kli shlishi. If you have something which is definitely not easily cooked, you are allowed to put it in a kli sheni. However, other than things like very tough meat, it is unclear exactly how to draw the line between easily cooked and non-easily cooked. And therefore, for something which definitely is easily cooked, we are stringent even for the kli shlishi. For something where we are being machmir, we don't know it's easily cooked. We don't need to be stringent beyond a second utensil, and therefore iroi kli sheni, pouring out of a second utensil, would be allowed. We're only stringent for the second utensil itself. So let me explain what this means in practical halachic terms. If you have, for example, instant coffee. Instant coffee isn't a problem to use on Shabbos because it is cooked already. The process of instant coffee is that it's condensed. Water is boiled with coffee beans, and then the liquid is condensed and reforms into sort of light crystals, coffee granules, and heated up in instant coffee. This is not kale habishul, sorry, this is ready cooked, and therefore there shouldn't be a problem with bishul with it on Shabbos. However, if you have, for example, I think the Gold Blends Nescafe, it has a certain percentage of real roast coffee which hasn't already been boiled. So this hasn't been boiled, it hasn't been cooked for this perspective. We'll get to the difference between boiling and roasting later, but it hasn't been cooked, nor have tea leaves been cooked. So to cook them on Shabbos in a kli sheni, in a second utensil, is potentially a problem, because maybe these are kale habishul, maybe these are things which are easily cooked. However, we don't really know they're kale habishul. They don't seem to easily fit the criteria of what Gemara meant when it spoke about kale habishul. It was really things which are cooked very, very quickly and instantly. And therefore, we shouldn't adopt the double stringency to also worry about iroi kli sheni, to also worry about things which are being poured out of a kli sheni. And therefore, from my point of view, you can heat these in a kli sheni, an iroi kli sheni, in the pouring out of a kli sheni. So you would take your urn, you would fill water from the urn, and then you could pour straight, that cup that you filled from the urn is kli sheni, and then you could pour straight from that cup over your tea leaves or your coffee mixture. Now, there's a very long-term practice in Klal Yisrael to avoid these things because these are awkward and difficult, and people make tea essence and coffee essence and so on. And I'm arguing with the appropriateness of that. But I'm simply saying, as far as core halacha is concerned, we don't need to adopt a double stringency. Tea leaves and even roast coffee is not clearly kali habishul. If you learn the sources, it probably isn't kali habishul. Iroi kli sheni is itself a chumrah, pouring out of a kli sheni is itself a stringency, and therefore we don't need to worry about that. So this is the halacha of kli rishon, kli sheni, and the pouring out of a kli sheni. Now I'll just spend time available speaking perhaps about a few other halachas that are applications of this, and then I'll try and draw this to a conclusion today, so that next time we learn, we can look at leaving food, heating food left on before Shabbos, and how those halachas work out. So let's talk about a few different and relevant scenarios. Okay, there's many principles that we still need to cover ground with, that I see we're not going to be able to finish this today. So I'm just going to share a few other principles, and then we're going to try and apply them to practical halacha. Before I speak, therefore, about other scenarios of kli rishon and kli sheni, I want to talk about reheating foods. When can and when can't I reheat food on Shabbat? And the basic halachic principle here is, ein bishul acha bishul. Once something is cooked, it is cooked. Once something is cooked, it's cooked. The melacha of bishul is changing the status of the food through heat, and once it's cooked, it already is cooked. However, there are two things that we need to bear in mind with this. The first is a presumption that there may be different types of cooking. In principle, roasting or dry cooking and wet cooking. One is known in halacha as tzli, roasting, and the second is mevushal, wet cooking. Now, from a halachic point of view, there's not a major distinction between the different forms of dry cooking, whether it's roasted on a spit, whether it is pot roasted in a dry pot, whether it is in a dish in the oven, and even if it is fried with very, very minimal amounts of oil, where you're just sprayed on oil to stop it sticking. All these cases are dry cooking. So if I have food which has only been boiled, I can't now bake it or roast it. If I have food which has only been baked, I can't boil it, because this creates a different form of eating experience. A baked potato is different to a boiled potato, and boiled chicken is different to roast chicken. So even though there's no cooking after cooking, nonetheless, if one has been roasted, I can't boil it, and if it's been boiled, I can't cook it. So this is one halachic principle. The second halachic scenario where I need to worry about cooking something which has already been cooked is if this is liquid. We already explained a couple of sessions ago that with something solid, the significant effect of the cooking is moving it from raw to cooked. With something liquid, the experience of eating it when it's hot is different to the experience of eating it when it is cold, and therefore potentially problematic. So these are the two exceptions to the rule: reheating something when I will change the type of cooking from boiling to roasting, or heating liquid when I change it from cold to hot. So let's just work through practical applications of this. Practical application number one: how do I determine if something is a solid or a liquid? Well, if the mass of it is pourable, it's a liquid. If it's not pourable, it's a solid. What happens if it has some liquid and some solid? So here, the presumed halachic determinant is that if it's basically a solid and there's no clear pooling of liquid, it just has some liquid gathered around it. It has some sweating around it. You know, it has some liquid gathered around it. Very few things are completely dry. If you take a piece of chicken and you reheat it, it has some fat and some liquid and moisture on it. That's called something that's dry. It's only if it has an independent pool of liquid on it that it would be defined as a liquid. So this seems to be the determinant. A solid is when it's solid, even if it has a little bit of sweat or moisture clinging to it. If it has a pool of liquid, then it would be determined as a liquid. If it is solid in its cold state, even though it will become a liquid when heated, then again we view this as a solid. And this is very, very relevant to congealed fat and the like. Very often one warms up something that looks dry, and when it finishes warming, you see a pool of liquid there, and one panics, has one done something wrong on Shabbos? This isn't a problem on Shabbos, because we treat this as something that is dry. So this is the halacha of reheating. If it is dry, it can be reheated. If it is hot, if it's liquid, then we assume that the heating is the problem, and I shouldn't reheat it if it has cooled down. If it's lukewarm, such that it's slightly chilled but still hot enough to eat, one can reheat it. So if I have soup which is pretty hot still and would be enjoyed as hot soup, I can increase the temperature, but if it's cooled down, I can't reheat it. That would be reheating and cooking on Shabbos. Similarly, I can't take my raw chicken, my cooked chicken, and heat it over a dry sauce, because now I'm roasting it. And here, this is very important to understand. This is only when I'm putting it over an intense heat source that will genuinely crisp it and roast it. If I'm just putting it over dry heat in order to warm it up, where I have no particular interest in a roasting effect, and it is a low level of heat that will take a long time to roast it significantly, in this case, it would not be a problem of roasting after cooking. So if you have boiled chicken and you want to put that on top of your urn Shabbos morning to heat it up, you don't need to say, oh, this is a terrible problem. I boiled it and now I'm dry heating it, because this isn't a way of roasting it. It's simply warming it up. You're not crisping it significantly. You have no particular interest to crisp it, and it is not an intense heat, and therefore this wouldn't be a problem. I'm going to stop here because we've run out of time, and I will try and draw conclusions to this in the next shiur, when we re-meet after the pre-Purim shiur in 2 weeks' time. And I hope I will enable everyone to come out clear from this. If anything I've said has not been clear, please let me know after the shiur, because I understand these halachas are complicated, and I really want the principles and the applications to come out clear to everyone. On the chat group, I've had a couple of questions posted over here. One is, should gold blend therefore not be added to water in klisheni? Yes, that's correct. That's what I'm saying. It shouldn't be added. If it's the gold blend that has the roast, is not all is not pure instant coffee, but it has some roast in it, then it shouldn't be added to klisheni, but it can be poured out from a klisheni. And someone wrote, is a hot plate considered a significant source of heat? Generally not with respect to roasting, but we will discuss hot plates either in the next shiur or the shiur after that. So I'll stop there, I'll pause there. I'm happy to stay on and take questions if anyone has any questions, but for today, thank you so much for joining, and I'll stop the shiur part of what I've been saying.